ancestors' diets were rich in the essential vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients needed for optimal function. But today, thanks to declining soil quality, a growing toxic burden, and other challenges in the modern world, most of us are not getting enough of these critical nutrients. That's why I created Adapt Naturals. It's a supplement line based on the principles of evolutionary biology and modern research that closes the nutrient gap so you can feel and perform your best. Unlike most supplements that contain cheap synthetic ingredients your body can't absorb, we use clinician grade, bioavailable ingredients to make a real and noticeable difference. Our products are manufactured in a CGMP facility without gluten or GMOs, and they're third party tested to validate ingredients and confirm they're free of contaminants like heavy metals. We have a full range of products from the most advanced multivitamin and phytonutrient formula on the market to a blend of 8 organic superfood mushrooms, including reishi, chaga, and lion's mane, to a one-of-a-kind fish oil with bioavailable forms of curcumin and black seed oil. Our newest product is BioVail Colostrum Plus, a blend of cold-processed colostrum from grass-fed cows, lactoferrin, and beta-glucan. These ingredients nourish the microbiome, fortify the gut, skin, and other barriers to keep pathogens, toxins, and other foreign substances out, fine-tune immunity to prevent hyperactive or inappropriate responses, and support the gut and immune system in numerous other ways. BioVail Colostrum Plus provides a powerful yet natural and safe way to protect against seasonal threats, balance and calm the immune response, and rebuild a healthy gut ecosystem. Head to adaptnaturals.com to learn more and start feeling and performing your best. Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. Throughout my career as a clinician, one of the most common scenarios that came up in practice that was always difficult for me and for patients was when someone who was lean went on a low-carb diet and saw their LDL cholesterol or ApoB or LDL particle number skyrocket. Everything else looked good, the blood sugar markers, inflammatory markers, even the calcium score. So overall, their cardiovascular risk seemed low, but they had this very high LDL level. And the question was always, does that matter? Are they at the same level of heart disease risk as someone else who has a very high LDL level but has other risk factors? Like, these are questions you would think would be fairly obvious and have easy answers to, but the fact is we didn't really have clinical research that shed light on that answer for this particular population. That has changed recently with the publication of some studies on the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, which is this group of people who are lean in body weight but have a pronounced response to a low carb or keto diet where their cholesterol levels skyrocket. So I'm very excited to welcome as my guest today Nick Norwitz. He completed his undergrad at Dartmouth, where he majored in cell biology and biochemistry and graduated valedictorian. He then completed his PhD at the University of Oxford in the UK in human metabolism and ketosis, and he's currently in his third year at Harvard Medical School completing his MD. And Nick himself was a lean mass hyperresponder. So when he adopted a low-carb and ketogenic diet, his LDL cholesterol went up to 500, which is just insanely high. He shares this publicly and talks about his own journey with this, which eventually led to him pairing up with Dave Feldman and a number of other people who've been active in this field, exploring this lean mass hyperresponder phenotype and something that we talk about in the show called the lipid energy model, which seems to contradict, at least on the surface, our dominant paradigm understanding of the role of LDL in the pathogenesis of cardiovascular disease. So these studies were fascinating. They raise many questions. They don't provide us answers yet, but they raise many important questions and will hopefully point us in a direction where we can continue to advance our understanding of heart disease, which is still the number one killer in the US and in many countries abroad. So hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Let's dive in. Dr. Nick Norwitz, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me on, Chris.
So here's a scenario from my practice that I came across, all the time. And it was one of the biggest ongoing questions for me as a clinician over the years and for my patients. A fairly lean person would adopt a low carb, high fat diet, sometimes keto for various reasons. Could be they wanted to lean out further, or it could be they were looking for cognitive improvements or just general health improvements. And all of their other biomarkers would improve, whatever it was that we were tracking, inflammatory markers, glucose, blood sugar regulation, et cetera. But very often their ApoB or LDLP, as we were measuring it at that time, would go up. And sometimes it would increase precipitously. We'd see 50% plus increases over, a couple months or 3-month period. And sometimes those would stabilize a little bit over time, but sometimes they would just maintain, they would remain elevated. And the conversation I had with those patients always looked something like this. Well, all of your other markers are good. You've had a calcium score is 0. You don't have a strong family history. Your blood pressure is normal. Pretty much everything that we can look at looks like you have a low risk for cardiovascular disease, except you have this very high ApoB, and the research that we have right now shows a correlation between high ApoB and cardiovascular events. We don't really know how that applies to someone in your situation, and there's really no published research to guide us. Like empirically, anecdotally, I would assume that if all of these things are getting better, your risk is likely going down. That's just what makes sense intuitively to me as a clinician. But we don't really know. Now, we might know a little bit more. So tell us a little about this study and what it means for people in that situation and beyond.
Yeah. So I'll start by not burying the lead. I found that to be the most engaging approach. Then I'm going to wrap proper context around it. But the study you're referring to that dropped a couple days ago was a lean mass hyperresponder, the phenotype you're describing, where somebody goes low carb, they're lean, they're using it for therapeutic reasons generally, although not always, sees the LDL skyrocket. Now you could talk about ApoB, LDLP, LDLC, LDL cholesterol. When somebody's a lean mass hyperresponder, they're all super high. I'm going to talk about LDLC when I'm saying LDL throughout this podcast. If I give you a number, it's LDLC, just because it's very easy to measure and it's what is standardly measured. So most people kind of register that in your mind, like a weight, like a BMI. It's just a common measure. So for reference, my LDLC, and I'll reveal I was a lean mass hyperresponder in the case. It's no secret by now if you've been following along. When I went low carb, this was in 2019, went up from 95 on a mixed diet to over 500. It was 545 at the peak. And then we did a block of research, what I'm going to get to. We have like 8 studies on this topic, but here's the problem. That scenario you're talking about, it's one that's becoming more and more frequent, and yet our research, for reasons I might get into later, let's just say hasn't been widely publicized. Now, I think this is something that we absolutely need to talk about as a scientific community. And so I engineered what I very much intended to be a very provocative experiment and a demonstration testing the model we think explains why this occurs. So the experiment was this, and I announced this before I did it. It was, I'm hypothesizing that I can lower my cholesterol from astronomically high levels so high that if most physicians see it, they either think it's a joke or that you have a terrible genetic condition. Those are the kind of the 2 options, a joke or a terrible genetic condition. But I thought, you know what, given what I understand, I predict I can lower this with Oreo cookies. Literally a sleeve of Oreo cookies. That was the intervention. Add a sleeve of Oreo cookies to my diet. Now, it sounds ridiculous. And in a sense, it is. But what you kind of try to do in science is take models that you have and you want to try to break them. So this was me trying to break my pre-existing model in a very robust and extreme manner, saying, according to the logic of my model, this should actually work. It sounds ridiculous, but it should work. And the punchline is it actually did. So I tested the lipid energy model on myself by predicting I could lower my cholesterol with Oreo cookies. And not only that, I did it in a very controlled manner, then had a washout period and compared it to high intensity statin therapy with my PCP and a consultant lipidologist on board. So I wasn't just doing this rogue. I went for IRB, got exemption, and all the bells and whistles to make this ethical. And the finding was that in just 2 weeks, or specifically 16 days, a sleeve of Oreo cookies added to my diet. I didn't reduce the fat. I added Oreo cookies to my diet, reduced my LDL cholesterol by 273 milligrams per deciliter, or 71%. By comparison, the statin lowered my LDL by 137, or 32.5% from its respective baseline. So the punchline here is, and the statin was a 6-week therapy, that in this test of the lipid energy model that I performed on myself, I was able to lower my cholesterol, my LDL cholesterol specifically, the so-called quote bad cholesterol, by twice as much with a sleeve of Oreo cookies as high intensity statin therapy. And the Oreo cookies work faster, which is, you know, set aside the fact that it sounds ridiculous, it's mind blowing. It should be mind blowing for everybody. And that's kind of the point. It needs to be the thing that, is the headline, and you look at it and you're like, what joke is this? And you're compelled to ask some more questions. Then you find actually there's some legit science behind this. Yes, this sounds like a ridiculous n equals one, but it's wrapped around all this really cool emerging science that we have, including really high tier rigorous science. Like right before this Oreo versus statin study came out, we had a meta analysis of 41 randomized controlled trials, also supporting the lipid energy model, which we can talk about. But again, it's just this data that we had wasn't being talked about enough. So I wanted to do something that would turn heads and get everybody talking about it. So, that was my goal. We'll see if it gets accomplished, but that's the punchline. Now I'll pause and then we can start to back up
Yeah,
and talk about the story that led up to this moment.
it's great. And I love that you're doing this to start a conversation. And, obviously an N equals one study isn't going to influence public health policy or,
Or should
change a
it?
paradigm in that respect. And it shouldn't, but it's still, to your point, it generates an interesting hypothesis and potentially takes a step towards validating the theory, which you're going to tell us a little bit more about shortly here, the lipid energy model, and then kind of working backwards to some of the research that was done previously, the lean mass hyperresponder study, and comparing calcium scores amongst people in different populations there. But maybe just since we are sort of working backwards from the Oreo study, what is the lipid energy model, and how does it differ from the conventional paradigm of understanding the pathogenesis of heart disease, particularly via the role of LDL?
Right. So the lipid energy model is a mechanistic explanation for the phenotype that you described when you were painting your patient vignette. When someone goes low carb, they typically are lean, metabolically healthy, and they see this massive increase in LDL with increases in HDL and low triglycerides. So let's first lay out the observations. You have this phenotype, so lean mass hyperresponders, let's be clear. They're defined by just this lipid triad: high LDL, high HDL, low triglycerides, generally on low carb diets. It's very rare to have this extreme profile not in a low carb setting. Now, there are also kind of associated observations. So, for example, it's not just generally lean people have this triad. If you look at the literature, there's a dose response effect whereby the leaner you are, the larger your increases in LDL. And not only that, but that inverse association between BMI and LDL on low carb diets is dominant in what drives high LDL in people who go low carb and see rises. So this was the topic of the meta-analysis that I mentioned. So a meta-analysis is like when you study a bunch of studies. And we studied a bunch of human randomized controlled trials. So you hear about randomized controlled trials, the gold standard. We took 41 of those, clustered them, and studied all of them. And what we found across them is that actually, when people go low carb, if you look at the RCTs and people who go low carb, only those in lean people show the increases in LDL. Those on overweight or class 1 obesity, no change. And those in class 2 obesity actually go down. And then you go across all studies again, there's an inverse association. And when you compare it to saturated fat, low BMI, being lean and metabolically healthy, actually dominates as a risk factor, heavy quotes there, for high LDL over saturated fat intake. So it's very interesting.
So a quick question about that, just for people who are not familiar with the study. Does that association is that only related to baseline factors when people are entering the study, or if someone is overweight with obesity and then they lose weight, significant amount of weight, does their LDL go up in the same way that, or in a similar way that someone who started with that was lean and adopted a low carb diet?
Because of that particular study design, I would say, quote, baseline. Well, I would say it's about the snapshot. It's about the point in time. As in, based on what I've seen in the literature, if someone started a low carb diet at, let's say, a BMI of 40, and then, stayed rigorously adherent to that, and their BMI started to drop, they might actually see a dip in LDL, and then it might stabilize. Let's say they were really good and they got down to, a BMI of, 25 and very muscular, then their LDL might actually shoot up. So this isn't something just inherent to lean people who have a genetic predisposition to being lean. This is a manifestation of being lean and insulin sensitive when you're low carb. And we have seen cases of people who started at like 300, 350 pounds, lost a lot of weight and lost so much weight that their pattern kind of inverted where the LDL started to dip, plateaued, and like I said, then shut up when they got really lean. So, these are the observations that, like, okay, you're having a generally good trend or improvements in health, and yet then you have this massive jump in this bad marker. And what do you make of that? How do you resolve that, let's say, clinical tension? And so the lipid energy model is just the explanation for why this occurs. And the high level overview is in the context of people who are insulin sensitive and lean. When you go low carb, you need to burn more fat as fuel. Your carb stores in your liver, your hepatic glycogen would be the medical term for it, gets depleted. And as it goes down, this system where by your circulating fat fuel ramps up. So free fatty acids that are circulating around in your bloodstream, they've been released by your fat cells, get taken up by the liver. They get packaged back onto the storage form of fat, which is called triglycerides. So you take three fatty acids, pop it onto a little glycerol backbone, got this little M-shaped molecule, and then you put that into a trafficking particle, kind of like a little ship. It's called a VLDL, very low density lipoprotein, and that's shipped out of your liver. And then at your muscle tissue and your fat cells, you turn that over. So the fat that is being trafficked around inside this core of this VLDL gets sucked out to be burned by our muscles, stored back in your fat, replenishing the fat. And in that process, what happens is the VLDL particle, the core gets sucked out, so the triglycerides are dropping really rapidly. The VLDL then shrinks, turns into an LDL with the shrinkage. And then if you think about it, taking a sphere and shrinking it, okay, again, the volume inside is decreasing. That's the triglycerides going down. The VLDL is then turned into an LDL. And the rim, the surface, needs to go somewhere. If you're reducing the size, reducing the surface area, the surface components include cholesterol, which then get transferred to HDL particles. So then you have your rise in your HDL cholesterol. So you can see if you ramp up this process, how you end up with high LDL because the VLDL turn into LDL, low triglycerides because the VLDL are being sucked of their triglycerides so fast, and then the high HDL. And then you end up with this lean mass hyperresponder triad. So the lipid energy model is that. And it explains the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype. And the cool thing about it, like any good model, is it makes predictions that you can test. And one prediction is if you put carbs back in your liver, then the driving force for the lipid energy model gets, turned down, tuned down. And what should happen? Your LDL should go down. So one way to test that is to add back carbs. You can add back any carbs. Oreo cookies should do the trick. And that was the spirit behind the test. Now, you might ask, oh, why not add, quote, healthy carbs, Nick? Well, we've done that. We had a case series back in even 2021, end of 2021. We did this with 5 patients. It worked incredibly. The average LDL drop was over 200. One patient had a 480 LDL drop. And then we had an interventional trial recently with 10 lean women. It worked the same. But here's the thing. You probably didn't hear about those because sweet potato lowers cholesterol isn't as grabby as Oreos lower cholesterol more than a statin. So what I did here was shamelessly to get attention for this work because, like I said, I think this is very cool, but it isn't being talked about a lot. We can talk more about the, let's say, political environment around this topic. Let's just say it's very charged, but I wanted to give let's just say, media something to spit out that would, again, make people turn heads and talk about the literature that's coming out, you're right. An N equals 1 is not going to change policy. It absolutely shouldn't. And I'm not making any health claims at all. I'm not saying Oreos are healthy or this proves anything about statins or LDL. It doesn't. The only thing it's supposed to do is make people drop their jaws, look, and then consider this as something interesting. So it's just supposed to pique curiosity. And then behind that curiosity, you can dig into, oh, there is a meta-analysis of RCTs. Oh, there are, institutes like UCLA and Harvard, groups that are digging into this. This is really cool, and I want to follow on this journey. So that was the purpose.
Yeah, makes sense. Can you talk a little bit about the study comparing calcium scores? I think that will be fascinating for people. And then from there, we can talk a little bit about how these various findings may cause us to question some of the dominant paradigm ideas of the pathogenesis of heart disease. Because in theory, if we go by what we know or what the prevailing theory is, if you have a higher number of LDL particles in your blood, that's going to increase the risk of vascular injury. Then that initiates the process of plaque formation, which then leads to eventually a heart attack or some other cardiovascular event. But
Yeah.
it may not be as simple as that. If this is true, if we have people with very high LDL levels who have calcium scores that are the same as people with normal LDL levels, then that at least introduces a question of why or how is that possible. So let's start with that study and then go from there.
Okay. I think you're referring to the study out of Lundquist.
Yes.
Yeah, after that is Professor Matthew Budoff. So this was a study that was spearheaded originally by my friend Dave Feldman. He's put blood, sweat, and tears into this one. And what they did or are doing is taking 100 people like me, lean mass hyperresponders are very similar to that phenotype, and they're following them over the period of 1 year to see, with these super high levels, are we seeing plaque progression? And I'll add that we're not just looking at coronary artery calcium scans, CACs. We're looking with coronary CT angiography, CCTAs. The distinction there is important because CCTAs look at non-calcified plaque as well. And the PI, the principal investigator on the study, is an expert in this field, and is the one that helped design the study, determined that the 1 year time frame, which with these levels, everyone felt was sufficient, or he and his team felt were sufficient to see if there would be rapid plaque progression. So that's the question. In people with levels this high, do you see rapid plaque progression? Now, I'll say the follow-up studies, the 1 year follow-up studies are going to be completed in February, I believe, and then the data need to be written up and published. But there's let's call it a cousin study that was done when all the baseline scans were collected. And so the results from that have been announced. The paper communicating them is under review currently. But I can speak about the results because they were announced at a conference by the PI. And what they did is take 80 subjects. They couldn't do all 100 because for the match, which I'm going to talk about, there were some outside the age range of the matching population. But they took 80 of them and then matched them for all the variables they could, except for LDL, to this population Miami heart with generally healthy adults and said, okay, we're taking these populations that are equal in age, so 55 years on average, a little above, just over half male, and then similar with respect to other risk factors, at least as tight as we could match them. There are unique things about lean mass hyperresponder profiles that make it almost impossible to match another population. That's a rabbit hole that we can go down if we want to. But bottom line, you have these two populations that are as well matched as they could have been. You ask the question, well, given that the one group has very high cholesterol, LDL levels on average were 272 in the keto group as compared to 123 in the Miami heart group. So that's almost 150 milligram per deciliter difference over the average time on keto for the keto group was 4.7 years. So almost 5 years, or close to 5 years, and with an elevation relative to a comparison group of over 150, or sorry, 149, about 150. And the question, is at baseline, quote baseline, because again, it's a 4.7 year exposure with levels of 272 for LDL. Is there increased plaque in the keto group? A lot of people probably would have thought, yeah, there probably would have been because that LDL is just so, so high. There wasn't. There was no significant difference in total plaque score between the groups. If you want to look at trends, because some could say, oh, the study's just underpowered, maybe there was a trend in one direction. Yeah, there actually was. The lean mass hyperresponders keto group was actually trending to lower plaque, if there was any trend at all. Again, not a significant difference. And also, there was no association between LDL levels and plaque. So across the keto group, some had LDLs of like, around 200. The highest was 591. Is there any correlation between LDL and plaque in these keto subjects? And there wasn't. Now, these are preliminary data that you need to take with a grain of salt. But what I would say is kind of what you said. We have a body of literature, but not in this population. So this is the kind of the first glimpse we have about what risk might be in this specific population. It doesn't necessarily change any paradigms immediately. It needs to be validated, nor should it change any guidelines at this point. But it is interesting data that should make us rethink what we think we know about, the currently existing paradigms. What I would say is there's a major hole, or let's not make it a hole. Let's say there's a major opportunity here in that the current model assumes that if you have very, very high LDL for a long enough period of time, it will just push cardiovascular disease. Like you will get it. That's the common, let's say, internalization of the model. Is that true? Well, think about what data we have. We have animal model data. We definitely have human data. We have like Mendelian randomization data showing that ApoB is causal. Causal is a word we can unpack a little bit because it doesn't mean sufficient. It doesn't mean it would actually push bulk flow. And then, we have conditions like familial hypercholesterolemia, which is where there's a genetic dysfunction in lipid metabolism. But none of these represent a case where there's apparently a metabolic response in people with a functional lipid metabolism. So FH, familial hypercholesterolemia, it's a congenital disorder where the lipid metabolism is broken. The LDL is high, but for a very, very different reason with potentially different consequences. So what we have here in lean mass hyperresponders is a very unique test of the question, can high LDL as a completely isolated variable just push cardiovascular disease? And the answer to that question is we don't know. It's even like heretical to say we don't know, but the honest answer is that we don't know. And so that's something we need to explore. As Peter Attia says it, and a lot of people, ApoB is necessary but not sufficient. As in, it alone probably, well, we don't have data to say it alone can drive cardiovascular disease. So now, what do you do with that patient you described? What do you do with that patient with incredibly high LDL but no other risk factors? And if maybe their high LDL has been that way for, let's say, 5, 10 years, I mean, it has to be a long period of time. Let's say they came to you with that and their CCTA is perfectly clean, showing no plaque. What is their risk? We don't know,
We don't
and we need to
know.
find out more.
And this is where clinicians will diverge based on their perspective. I know Peter and his tendency in that situation would be to prescribe a statin. So, his way of thinking of it is all other things equal. If you have two people and they both are free of all other risk factors for cardiovascular disease, but one has high ApoB, then the other person who has normal ApoB will be at lower risk. We should therefore do everything we can to reduce ApoB in
But
that
there's a flaw in
person.
that logic, and that's the are all things you said all things being equal. When are all things equal? You can't snap your fingers
Exactly.
and change a biomarker.
Yeah.
Like it requires an intervention. So for some patients, it's harder than others if they're using ketogenic diet therapeutically. But no matter what, there's an intervention that's changing other variables in the situation of a whole person. So you're right in what you just said. And if Peter phrases it like that, then he's probably technically right. But all things aren't equal. So I reject that premise.
If you've listened to this show for a while, you know that I'm a super active guy. Depending on the time of year, I'm either skiing, mountain biking, hiking, backpacking, surfing, or lifting weights on most days of the week. I also live in a really dry climate at high elevation. For these reasons, I pay a lot of attention to hydration. I've learned the hard way what happens when I get dehydrated, and I know how important hydration is to overall health. But hydration isn't just about drinking water, it's about water plus electrolytes. This is where Element comes in. It's a combination of electrolytes like sodium, potassium, and magnesium in easy to use individual packets that you just add right to your water bottle. And unlike most electrolyte products on the market, Element is free of sugar and artificial junk. I drink Element every day, and it's made a huge difference in how I feel. Even with my training and profession, I don't think I realized how often I was dehydrated before I made Element part of my daily routine. If you'd like to try it, the folks at Element have an exclusive offer for my podcast listeners. You can get a free sample pack with one of each of the 8 flavors Element sells when you purchase any Element product. This is perfect for anyone who wants to try all of the flavors or who wants to introduce a friend to Element. Just go to kresser.co/element, that's LMNT, to place an order and take advantage of this offer. You've probably heard a lot about colostrum lately, and for good reason. Colostrum is Mother Nature's perfect first food. It's the nutrient rich fluid female mammals produce in the first few days after giving birth and is packed with essential nutrients, antibodies, growth factors, and other bioactive compounds. Colostrum nourishes the gut microbiome, supports the mucosal barriers, protects against infections, and modulates the immune response. It's no exaggeration to say that supporting our gut immune axis is one of the most important things we can do to improve our overall health and extend our lifespan. That's why I'm so excited to tell you about BioVail Colostrum Plus from Adapt Naturals. It contains 2.5 grams of colostrum per serving, which is 2.5 times more than most competitors. This is critical because studies documenting colostrum's benefits typically use a dose of 2 grams or more. We source our colostrum from grass fed, pasture raised farms across the US, and it's free from pesticides, heavy metals, antibiotics, and hormones. It also has higher immunoglobulin content than competing products, 40% versus 25%, and it's cold processed to keep the fragile immunoglobulins and other nutrients intact. But I didn't stop there. I included 2 more compounds that support gut and immune health: lactoferrin and beta glucan. Lactoferrin plays a vital role in defending against microbial invaders, promoting gut health, and enhancing the immune system's effectiveness. Beta glucan is a biological response modifier that trains the immune system to function more efficiently. It's also a prebiotic that nourishes the growth of beneficial bacteria. BioVail Colostrum Plus is the first and only product on the market to contain all 3 of these powerful yet gentle and safe ingredients. Visit adaptnaturals.com to learn more and place your first order. That's the problem. And also patients have different preferences. I've some patients just don't want to do statin therapy or cholesterol lowering therapy, and they're willing to, when I explain it in the terms that you just did, and I say, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, it's really up to you ultimately what you want to do here. And a lot of times patients are willing to take whatever perceived risk there is to having a high LDL, in part because they feel great. They've made this change often. Everything else has improved. All of their other biomarkers have improved. And they are not willing to risk possible side effects and other complications with statin therapy for an unknown benefit, that is not possible to quantify at this point. So, yeah, it seems to me that this is the $1,000,000 question. And until what you've been working on with Dave and others, like, we have not really had an active effort to really answer this question because, the cynic might say there's not really much motivation for this question to be answered by the pharmaceutical industry, which funds a lot of this research. And that's what is amazing about some of these studies. We should point out that a lot of them have been citizen funded, which is how they got done in the first place, right?
It's really a problematic research ecosystem. It's really hard to do rigorous studies in nutrition and metabolism with those interventions because, yeah, the funding is really scarce because it's not really that lucrative. That's just the incentive structure that we have set up. It's not pointing fingers at any individual, but it's the truth. And yeah, there isn't. I mean, like, that's the thing for me, as someone in this space. I look at this stuff, these phenomena, and I'm like, this is so cool. Why is everybody in medicine not like, whoa, we need to like explore this and getting excited? And I think it's just because people aren't really aware that this is legit. And I think with a little bit more awareness, we will get that will to study it because it is so interesting.
I think that's part of it, Nick, but there is another part that is, if you think about like physics as a discipline, as a
Hmm.
scientific discipline, people who are physicists get legitimately excited when there's a finding that contradicts the dominant paradigm of understanding. It's not always, but very often the case. I think with medicine, it's trickier because there's a lot of there's no public health policy around physics research. It's not like there's nobody out there making recommendations that affect choices that people make on a day-to-day basis about what food they eat, what medications they take, and all that stuff. So there's like the stakes are really high, and ego then gets involved like it does in all scientific disciplines. But then there's a lot of money. There are big forces at play. So it seems more difficult for physicians, researchers to have that kind of open-minded, curious attitude in our current scientific paradigm in medicine. To me, I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying that seems to be much less common. That type of curiosity and interest that you have.
I think that's probably true on the whole. I guess what I'd layer on to that is there's just so much in medicine. It's so broad and there's so much asked of every practitioner that what I see, at least what I've seen in my training thus far, is like you choose your battle, you choose what you're really passionate about, and everything else, you don't have time to go to the primary literature for everything. It's literally impossible. So you do have to kind of take the word of the authorities to some level. It's not ideal, and I think we should always be questioning, but I think that there's a laissez-faire nature and a trustingness which allows certain dogmas to perpetuate. It's not ideal. Well, it's not even good. It just it can retard the process of science. But in the end, I do have confidence that over the long arc, the data do win out, which is why I'm so chipper on the whole about, this because the data will show what it will show. It's a little irritating when certain people caricaturize the data, misrepresent it, and then you have to go back and clarify again and again and push in what seem ridiculous ways like Oreo versus statin. But you know what? It's the process. It's the one we have, and so you might as well kind of enjoy playing, the game to some extent, if I may use that euphemism, which is what I'm trying to do. If I didn't take that mindset, I'd be burnt out already at age 28.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's when you have people who've built an entire career around a particular belief system or, paradigm, it can be, if I'm, if we really sort of try to empathize with them, it can be very challenging and threatening for them to take in information that is antithetical or potentially antithetical to that approach that they've spent their entire lifetime, supporting and building their career around. And we would still hope that just ethically and with scientific integrity, that someone in that position would be open to data that challenges that viewpoint, simply because that's the right thing to do. It's how science progresses, and being willing to continually prove your own hypotheses false is kind of the basic approach in science. So I know, I'm not, to be honest, very active on social media at this point, in part because the vitriol is so old, gets so old and tiring for even as an observer. I'm not really involved in it that much anymore. But let's talk a little bit about this response, and how it, like, what has been the range of responses that you've received in the professional medical community and also amongst citizen scientists and people who are following along, just for their own edification and knowledge?
And 99.9% have been what I hoped they would be, which is wow, this is interesting. Wow, this is cool. Well, actually, let's call that 95%, and then 4.9% make jokes about going to get Oreo cookies or cheesecake, which are clearly jokes. I don't think many people are actually being persuaded that Oreo cookies are healthy, and we're pretty clear about caveating that. Of course, there's the remaining like 0.1% who don't understand the purpose or want to make snide remarks. And they can do that, and I understand why they would. It's going to be, a provocative headline or two. But on the whole, people have been engaging, I think, really authentically and with the interest that I think this was intended to provoke. Like, whoa, this is so cool. And a lot of, oh, this is me, as in I am a lean mass hyperresponder and I, or I know one or I treated one. I've actually gotten lots of emails from like resident physicians who are like, I have lean mass hyperresponder patients. I've been following this story and this is so cool. Like, I'm so excited. I got a couple emails from residents who were asking about, how they can get involved. They can write up case reports on their patients or case series. So a lot of it has just been, communicating back to us the scientific awe and curiosity that we feel, which is very heartening. Overall, the response has been incredibly robust in terms of the metrics. So, for example, like we talked about incentives a little bit in research. One incentive is, journals want attention. So there are actually attention metrics that papers have, something called like an alt metric score. And our paper jumped to the top 0.05% within a day. So for reference, a score, a New England Journal, I think is the highest impact factor journal in the world. The average lifetime score for a paper in New England Journal is 128. Our score in one day was 1,113. So, the response was robust. I've gotten lots of emails from reporters. The video abstract hit like 200,000 views in a day or two. I woke up day two with 2,000 emails in my inbox. It's been pretty overwhelming, but it's been exciting. It's the response that I wanted. It's why I did this experiment. People coming out and saying, I want to learn more. That was the point. I'm not trying to prove anything. I wanted to put forth with this uncomfortable tension that you have this clearly unhealthy intervention and then what is perceived to be a good response. And the question that's implicit there is how do you resolve these things? I'm not presenting an answer. I'm not making a value judgment, but I'm putting forth an uncomfortable question. And the job of science really is to deal with questions, particularly the uncomfortable ones. So it's really exciting that people are coming out and generally just expressing curiosity and wanting to learn more about this topic.
Yeah, great. So I mentioned this a couple of times, and I know the ultimate question or the answer here is I don't know. We don't know. But what do you speculate, and do others who have kind of participated in these studies and are familiar with and the lean mass hyperresponder and lipid energy model hypothesis speculate is going on with people who are lean mass hyperresponders and have very high LDL and know, according to these scans, no difference in coronary plaque relative to people with normal LDL. If it's, and I've of course familiar with the statistics, 9 in 10 people who have high cholesterol, which usually involves high LDL, who have heart attacks, have at least one other significant risk factor. So that kind of goes back to what Peter Attia is saying with the ApoB is required but not sufficient on its own to lead to some kind of cardiovascular event. Have any of the studies that you've done looked at these other potential factors, and what would you or others in your field speculate that those that might be differentiating factors that drive risk in addition to LDL-C or ApoB?
Yeah, well, there's a bunch of different studies looking at often in quantitative manners the relative risk of different profiles, things like diabetes or smoking, being sedentary, et cetera, et cetera. The specific numbers aren't really important for this discussion. It's more about, what is the overall risk profile of any given patient, and what does it mean when you only have LDL as the isolated risk factor with everything else being perfect, and where that LDL appears to be just not, let's say a congenital anomaly, which is a term I'm using for a genetic break, like an FH, but it's part of a apparent metabolic response to something. So if the answer is the lipid energy model in these cases, if that's the description or the explanation, then you have to ask, the body's doing this for a reason. Does it then follow that the body might have, it's this is a short-term adaptive response, let me put it that way. It doesn't per se follow that it's long-term healthy, but I would say it might increase the probability that the body's smart enough to figure out, okay, I'm ramping up this system, but I don't want the system to hurt me at the same time. You know what I mean? So you can probably read between the lines and guess what my predictions might be. I would say if we were talking about lab rats, I might be more explicit. Because we're talking about human beings and there's an absence of evidence, and I don't think people should gamble with their heart health, I'm just going to leave it at we don't know and we need more answers because that's the most honest thing. And without evidence, again, it makes sense to take as conservative a position as you can because this isn't something you want to be cavalier about and gamble with. So that's why, a lot of experts will recommend getting scans on yourself, especially if you have had high levels for a long period of time and are a little bit older, because then you can get a sense of, what's your baseline, what's your buffer room. It's very different. I've gotten scans. I'm not really surprised that my CCTAs are perfectly clean because I'm younger. And it's a very different profile if somebody say is 55, their LDL is 500, and they have existing plaque, because then look, they don't have buffer room to play with. Play being a euphemism here. I mean, like obviously it's not a game, but whereas if somebody has no plaque, well, you know, it's you have a little bit more buffer room, so to speak. So it's a you take it on an individual basis kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think still, many of the other traditional risk factors like blood pressure and, family history, things like that come into play here. And the fewer of those you have overall, the more buffer there might be. And the more of those you have, the less buffer there might be. Unless there's something very wrong with our understanding of cardiovascular disease. So what's next? We know what the questions are that are still outstanding. What are you guys working on for future directions?
Well, I have a whole list of projects we want to do. A couple that are at the top of my list are, well, first finishing the risk study with the CCTAs and also replicating that in a form with the triad study. I want to know personally, or actually not just personally, we want to know is how replicatable is this phenotype? If we can, take people that we think would turn into lean mass hyperresponders, but who have never been lean and control them, how much could we just, prospectively convert into lean mass hyperresponders? I think it's a pretty high percentage. I think this is predominantly a metabolic response, maybe with some permissive genetics, but I think under the right circumstances, almost, well, I'm not going to say almost everybody, but most could turn into lean mass hyperresponders. But that's something that's important to actually prove. And then another study I'd like to do is, I did this provocative Oreo versus statin, and I demonstrated to myself that carbs are pretty potent. But I'd like to, on larger scale, do actually a three-way crossover where we take a population of lean mass hyperresponders and treat them with carb reintroduction versus statins versus ezetimibe. I actually hypothesized the ezetimibe might punch above its weight relative to statins, particularly in this population. But that, again, gives us some mechanistic insight, and it will give clinicians valuable insight, too, to provide personalized treatments to their patients. So it's one of those things that should be very appealing to everybody, and therefore something that everybody could get behind and hopefully, support, including pushing for funding. So again, I have dozens of projects I'd like to do. Those are some of the top on my list.
Yeah. For the record, in my anecdotal, unpublished clinical experience over the last 15 years, that's exactly what I would do if we reach this point where the conversation was, okay, you have high ApoB or LDLP or LDLC, whatever it is that we were measuring, and that patient was not comfortable having that high of LDL, but they didn't want to do statin therapy, then I would suggest carbohydrate reintroduction. And we would usually do, it obviously depended on their other, if on their other goals. And if they were coming from a background of being overweight and they know that, eating carbohydrates will rapidly add more weight back on, then we would be obviously careful about that. But in other cases, if they were lean and they were just pursuing low carb for other reasons, then we would, be a little bit more liberal with the carbohydrate reintroduction. Not Oreos generally, but this was more the healthy variety, sweet
Yeah.
potatoes, plantains, stuff like that. And almost universally, I saw the same thing that you did. We could get, it was very comforting to them to know that they could easily get their LDL to drop like a rock just by eating some carbs for a week.
So I want to jump on that because it does provide some of the, it highlights the direct utility of what I've done, even if it sounds ridiculous. Because what we know from, clinicians like you treating patients like you did, and I've seen this again and again, is this can be incredibly effective for patients who don't have or need therapeutic ketosis. But if, clinicians broadly aren't aware of it, then it doesn't present as really a clinical option. If the default is, oh, you must have a genetic dysfunction, or something going on, so we need to treat you with pharmacotherapy now for life, without first exploring the option of, yeah, a sweet potato, a banana, a mango. I mean, I'm not now a licensed clinician. I'm in my third year of medical school, so I'm not providing medical advice. But in chat groups, we've had people respond with, "Oh, these are my numbers," and I'm like, "What's your favorite carb?" They're like, "I like mango." I'm like, "Eat some mango, see what happens,"
Yeah,
or consider eating some mango. Or if I were you, I try to be very careful with my language.
of
If I were you, I might
course.
just play around with some mango, maybe a large mango per day, and just see what happens. And then
Yeah.
they come back and say, "Oh wow, my LDL dropped from like 390 to like 100."
Well, that's what's fascinating about it is it doesn't have to be, in my experience, a lot of carbohydrate. Someone could go from 5% of calories is like very low carb to like 10%. Okay, yes, that's doubling on a relative basis, but you're still at a an absolutely low level of carbohydrate intake, and it can have a huge impact on the lipid profile.
Yeah. So people need to be aware of this. Clinicians need to be aware of this if they're going to use it as an option. And so, as ridiculous as it might sound, if Oreo versus statin captures headlines and people just look one level beyond that, it becomes very obvious. Oh, if I have a patient like this, maybe I should try to treat him with a sweet potato before I start high dose Crestor and just see what happens because it might be twice as effective. And then all they're doing is eating a sweet potato. And they don't need to take this medication for life, and everybody's happier. Maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Nick, really appreciate this conversation. Where's the best place for people to follow what you guys are up to?
Yeah, you can follow me at Nick Norwitz on Twitter, and then at Lipoprotein is Professor William Cromwell. He was the senior author on this project. At Real Dave Feldman was the guy who coined lipid energy model and a close friend of mine. And then, if you really think this is exciting, what we talked about and it's important research, there is a concrete way that you can really help us. As I mentioned, attention metrics and the grassroots movement here through the citizen kind of science community really helps push the research forward. So, if I may be so bold to ask a favor, take the link below and associated with this conversation. It's a link straight to the paper and share it on social media, in particular Twitter or X, with the link to the tweet. Provide a commentary, or you can quote retweet my tweet. Right now, it's my pinned tweet. It's Oreo versus statin, and leave a comment. Those things get picked up, and they're important. And also, if you wouldn't mind watching, there's a just under 8 minute video abstract, which my friend put blood, sweat, and tears into animating. It's doing great. It's, I think, incredibly enticing. You'll have fun watching it, and it will explain really what happened in this study and why it's so important. So you can find that on my YouTube. Again, if you just Google Nick Norwitz, I don't think there's another Nick Norwitz among the near 8 billion people in the world. I'm not hard to find. So watch the video, share it around. Again, this is just about, getting chatter going, expressing your curiosity. We want to hear about it. You can also leave a comment in the YouTube video. Starting next week on a sub internship, I'll be particularly busy, but I do try to read all the comments and reply to as many as I possibly can. I think I've replied to like 800 today, so I will try my best, but I do like to hear from people, so I'd appreciate it.
Great. Yeah, we'll put all that in the show notes on the website so people can easily access it. And Nick, really appreciate your time and all the work that you're doing and continuing to ask good questions and hopefully move the conversation forward and give us more clarity on these important questions, because heart attack is still the leading cause of death, and it's of enormous importance that we get more clarity here. So really appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay, everyone, thanks for listening. Send your questions at chriskresser.com/podcast question. We'll see you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.